Hey, everybody, and welcome to another deep dive with us. Today, we're looking at something I think we can all relate to: personality traits. Like how we describe ourselves and other people. And get this, our source material is actually an English learning podcast.
Yeah, which I think is really interesting because by looking at personality through the lens of language learning, we get these really cool insights into how language shapes how we see those traits.
It's true. It's like we're not only learning new words, but we're kind of figuring out how those words show cultural values and like judgments about personality.
Hmm.
Okay, so the source material starts off with this awesome spectrum of adjectives.
Right. It goes everywhere from adventurous and outgoing to.
To reckless and clumsy.
Right.
It just shows how many different kinds of personalities are out there.
For sure.
It really makes you wonder, where do you fall on that spectrum? Are you more diligent or maybe a little naive? No judgment here, just some interesting things to think about.
Hmm.
But something that really jumped out at me is how these words can have different meanings in different cultures.
Oh, absolutely. The podcast used the example of superstitious. In some cultures, being superstitious is just part of life, like avoiding walking under a ladder. But in other cultures, people might just think that's silly.
Exactly. So what might be seen as a negative trait in one culture could be totally neutral or even positive somewhere else. It's not just about what the dictionary says, it's about what the culture says. And talking about meaning, the material really stressed how important it is to use the right words to describe yourself, especially in things like job interviews.
Definitely. The words you choose are so powerful, especially when you want to make a good impression. They highlighted words like eloquent and magnanimous as examples of words that can really make you stand out.
Eloquent, now that's a word I love. It makes me think of someone who is so good with words, articulate, persuasive.
Exactly. And magnanimous that suggests generosity and a kind of nobility. Those are
Oh.
definitely qualities employers are looking for.
So that makes me wonder, how can you use language to better express your personality, especially at work? Are there words you use now that you could switch out for something with more punch?
Maybe. It might be helpful to look at synonyms for the words you usually use. That might be a word that captures you better or more powerfully.
I think it's a great exercise to think about how your word choices shape how other people see you. Now, the podcast also talked about a personality type. I
Yeah.
think we all know the type A personality.
Ah, yes. The classic type A, hardworking, ambitious, always on the go. Those are often seen as good things, but the podcast pointed out that there's another side to that coin.
Right. If you take those traits too far, they can turn into workaholism, stress, even burnout. It just goes to show that even positive qualities can have their downsides if you're not careful.
It really speaks to this bigger idea of balance. Most personality traits aren't inherently good or bad on their own. It's about how much they show up and the situation. Like you can be assertive without being aggressive, or organized without being rigid.
Okay, now for the part I know you've all been waiting for, the podcast actually gave us a little homework assignment. They want us to find one adjective that best describes our personality.
I love that. Just one word to sum up who you are. That's actually harder than it sounds.
Right. I'm already going through all these words in my head, trying to decide, am I more creative or analytical, compassionate or determined? So many choices.
That's what makes it so cool, though. This exercise makes you boil down your essence, figure out the qualities that really make you, you.
And it can be so revealing. You might learn something about yourself that you hadn't even realized before.
Maybe a good way to start is to just brainstorm a bunch of words, then narrow it down from there. Think about how you are at work, with friends, on your own.
And don't be afraid to think outside the box.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there's a word that doesn't usually describe personality, but it just fits you perfectly. Like, what if someone describes themselves as effervescent? Not your typical trait, but it definitely creates a strong image.
I agree. Don't limit yourself. It's about exploring all the little details of how you see yourself.
Now, if you're feeling stuck, the podcast had some good advice. They said to think about how you want others to see you, which is an interesting angle, right?
Yeah, it is. It's not just about how we see ourselves, but also about how we present ourselves to the world. Think about the impression you want to make. Do you want to seem approachable, driven, maybe witty? Pick a word that matches your personal brand, so to speak.
It's like coming up with your own personal slogan. I love that. And it reminds us that how we see ourselves isn't always the same as how others see us.
Right, and don't be afraid to come back to this exercise later on. Our personalities are always changing, so the word that fits you best today might be different in a year or two.
That's so true. We're always growing, always changing, and our language should show that. This whole deep dive makes me want to go grab a thesaurus and just dive
Yeah,
in.
there's always something new to learn about language and how it shapes our understanding of ourselves and everyone around us.
So just to recap, we've looked at all kinds of personality traits, the good and the, well, maybe not so good.
We've seen how these words have cultural baggage and how
Hmm.
they can be used strategically to make certain impressions. And of course, we've been challenged to find that one perfect adjective that sums us up, which is tougher than it sounds.
It really is. But it's something to really think about, and I'm super curious to hear what our listeners come up with.
Me too. But before we finish up, I have one last question for you. If you could change one thing about your personality, what would it be? And maybe even more important, why would you want to change it?
That's a really good question. It really gets at like self-improvement, right?
It makes us think about what it means to be the best version of ourselves, and that's not always easy.
No, it's not. I mean, even realizing what you want to change about yourself takes a lot of self-awareness.
It takes courage, too, you know? Facing things about ourselves that we want to work on isn't always comfortable.
Speaking of facing things, I think it's interesting that this English learning podcast even brought up personality traits in the first place.
It shows how important personality is to how we communicate. Even if you're learning a new language, understanding how people describe themselves and others is really important for talking to people well.
It's like you can learn all the grammar, vocabulary, but if you don't get the culture behind how people see personality, you're missing something big.
Exactly. That's why I'm really enjoying this deep dive. It's not just about learning new words, it's about understanding what those words mean and how they reflect different values.
And I think that's a big takeaway for our listeners. As you go through life traveling, working with people from different cultures, even just making new friends, being aware of how different cultures see personality is super helpful.
It can help you avoid misunderstandings, connect with people better, and even just appreciate how different people are.
And it all comes back to language. It's amazing how choosing the right word to describe yourself can make such a difference.
Words are powerful. They shape how we think, how we see things, and how we talk to each other.
And that's why I'm so glad we're doing this deep dive into personality traits. It's giving us a new way to see human nature and how language shapes how we understand ourselves and other people.
It's been a real journey of discovery, not just about personality, but about language and how we communicate across cultures.
So as we wrap up this part of the deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. We talk about finding one word to describe yourself. But what about the words that describe who you want to be?
Ooh, that's a good one. Instead of just focusing on who we are now, let's think about who we want to become.
Exactly. What qualities do you hope to develop? What words do you want to live by in the future? Maybe it's resilience, creativity, empathy.
It's a great way to picture the best version of ourselves and start making changes to get there.
It reminds us that our personalities aren't set in stone. We can grow and change, work on ourselves, and become who we want to be.
So keep going on your journey, dear listener. Remember, you have the power to write your own story, choose the words that define you, and create a life that reflects who you are and who you want to be.
And if you ever need some inspiration, don't be shy about coming back and listening to this deep dive again. We're always here to help you explore the world of personality and the power of language.
Until next time, happy exploring.
Happy exploring.
Oh.
Wow, this has been such a cool deep dive into personality, all thanks to this English learning podcast.
Right. Who knew we'd end up thinking so much about ourselves? It just goes to show you language is way more than just words.
It really is. It's like a peek into different cultures, values, what it means to be human.
Absolutely.
And I hope you've gotten some good insights from this, dear listener. We talk about all sorts of personality traits, how their meaning changes from culture to culture, even how to choose the right words to describe yourself.
We saw how language can be a real tool, especially when you're at work, to make the impression you want. And we dug into personality types, seeing how even good traits can have a flip side.
But I think the biggest thing we learned is that your personality isn't set in stone. You can shape it and change it by knowing yourself, making an effort, and even watching the language you use.
It's true. We can grow and become better, and it's a process that never really ends.
And speaking of becoming better, I'm curious, what did you come up with for that homework? Remember, we asked you to find one adjective that sums up your personality. Did you find your word?
Yeah, tell us, what word feels like it really gets you, with all your strengths and quirks and everything?
Now, as we wrap things up, I want to leave you with one last thought. We talked about that one word that describes you, but what about the words that describe who you want to be?
Oh, that's interesting. Instead of just thinking about who we are now, what about who we want to be?
Right. What kind of person do you dream of becoming? What words do you want people to use for you? Maybe it's resilient, creative, empathetic.
That's a powerful way to imagine the best version of yourself and start making it happen.
And it reminds us that personality isn't fixed. We can grow, change, become the people we want to be.
So, dear listener, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep growing. Never forget how powerful language is. It can shape your world and who you become.
That's a great note to end on. Until next time, everyone, happy exploring.
Happy exploring!